Be seated.
Officer Decker, have you testified previously in trials how many trials have you testified in previously?
I think it's 11 cases, one of those in Pierce County.
Were the others in King County?
Yes.
And were some of those also homicide trials?
Yes.
I'm going to show you some photographs in a moment relating to this case and talk a little more about your opinions. I want to first ask you, though, at the time you responded to this scene and formed your initial opinions, you were one level lower than you are now in the tracker. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So you're now the highest level.
Right.
Have you, since your work in 2006 and the forming of your opinions back then, reviewed everything with the additional experience you have since gained since 2006?
Yes.
And did that cause you to change any of the opinions that you formed then, or do you still feel confident in those opinions?
I still feel confident in those opinions.
I want to show you some photographs.
State Exhibit 35.
Why don't you take a look at those for a moment? I'm going to give a copy to counsel. Just flip through those if you would.
Sept 35.
Are those photographs of the location in and around where Nicole's body was found?
Yes.
And do those fairly and accurately represent the area as you saw it that day on February 6th?
Yes.
Your Honor, I would offer Exhibit 35 at this time.
No objection.
Do you want to reserve your prior objection?
Yes, Your Honor, of course.
All right.
And-
They are admitted.
Thank you, Your Honor. And before we show those to the jury, I just want to ask a few questions. Are some of those photos that you took to remind yourself of areas where you made observations relevant to tracking?
Yes.
Now, when we put these photos up, are you as able to see in the photos as you were able to see that day at the scene?
No.
So can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, is there a problem sometimes between using photographs versus real life viewing at tracking scenes?
Yes. Photograph, of course, is two-dimensional. You don't have all the different dimensions. You don't have the ability to use all of your senses. You don't have the ability to use light to your advantage. So the photographs that I took that day were merely to refresh my memory and my recollection so that when I wrote my report, I was accurate in my descriptions. The photographs that we're going to be taking a look at do show some very good information, but it's not going to be as clear to you as it would be if you were actually there that day looking at the damage.
So when I'm asking you some questions about these photos, at some points I'm going to have you come down here and show what you were observing. Is it fair to say the jury may not be able to see quite as well from these as you saw that day?
Very fair to say.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time I'm going to publish that exhibit to the jury with your permission.
You may.
Can we dim the lights slightly for the beginning part of this? I just want to make sure the jury's here. Okay. So first, though, I want to turn to photograph A and just orient us with this photograph, Officer Decker. First of all, what are we seeing? What area are we at in photograph A here?
Yes, this is a photograph that's taken from the west, looks like looking east, and what you're looking at is that path of least resistance I made reference to come into the scene. So access would be from the pavement towards us, and that is what I was referencing as the trail.
So let me ask, what direction are we facing looking at this photo? Towards where the gentleman in the yellow is?
I believe that's east.
Okay, so the photographer is west.
West, yes.
So Nicole Pietz's body, is it west of what we're seeing in this photograph?
That's, again, the problem with photographs is the spatial aspect. I don't know if it might be a little bit west, but it's also going to be to the north or to the left as you're standing facing this photograph.
I'm going to have you step down for a moment, and I want you to look at Exhibit 22. If you could step between the television and this exhibit, and show the jury where your best memory is on Exhibit 22, where this path of least resistance trail would have been.
Yes, it would be right in this area here.
Okay. So you're motioning right above the X1 towards the X6 area?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you just point on Exhibit 22 where Nicole's body is documented?
That would be right here.
And this trail, if we want to call it that sort of came through this area, did it go all the way to the point of Ms. Pietz's body, or did at some point is the body away from that area?
At some point, the body is off the trail. It's a little away trail, if you will, that was formed, which just means that an individual took an alternative route off that main thoroughfare, and that's where she's resting from this.
I'm going to have you stay there if you would for a moment, and I want to ask if you're aware, this photograph that we're seeing here, is this how it looked? In other words, has law enforcement done any clearing of the area, this area, yet, when this photograph was taken?
I do not believe so.
Okay. Turning to photograph B, are we looking the other direction now from where we were just looking, down the trail?
I believe so. So, yes, you'd be looking at, again, this path of least resistance is the path that you see right here.
Okay. So again, when you've referred to that, this is what you're talking about?
Yes.
And is it fair to say, is that an area where the bushes or foliage is sort of tramped down, or how would you describe it?
Yes, it's an area where, as a result of individuals walking on and through, you have some vinage that's been stepped upon, that's down on the ground. You have some twigs that have been stepped upon, some scuffing that has occurred. And what's hard to see from the photograph, but there's actually a little bit of a slight U shape, just that has formed from the trail.
And does that indicate to you that there has been people who passed through there?
Yes.
I'm now going to get some photos that show Ms. Pietz's body, and I know that in asking you questions, you're going to have to point to things and refer to things that may be a little difficult to look at, but bear with me. Turning to photograph C, is the body visible at some point in this photo, someplace in this photo?
Yes.
Okay. Can you point for the jury where Ms. Pietz's body is?
Yes. It's going to be right here.
And describe, is this, are we seeing blackberry vines? What are we seeing in this photograph?
Yes, you're actually seeing quite an extensive amount of blackberry vines.
And what else are we seeing? Is it any of the other stuff you described earlier? You talked about alder leaves, things like that. Can you describe what else we're seeing around this area?
Yes, the darkened color here is essentially just leaf litter that has formed over the years and has decayed. And so you see that brown kind of color on the ground, some of which you can recognize as leaves, and those are the alder leaves that have fallen over time. And then you have the vines and stakes and branches and what have you, that's just kind of the normal course of what we have here in the Pacific Northwest.
And at some point, to your knowledge, did law enforcement clear the area around her body a little bit?
Yes, they did.
And has that been done or not been done in this photograph?
That has not been done yet.
And there's some testimony earlier from Sergeant McNabb about sort of the order that people come to a scene. As the tracker, do you know how many law enforcement personnel might have already gone to the scene before you did your work?
Well, typically, there's always going to be the first responder. So an officer or deputy gets the call, responds to the call, makes an inquiry, in this case would have walked in to verify that she was actually there and presumably then walked back out. There may have also been some medical personnel, I don't know, but it's typical that that would be the case. And as a tracker, we would like to get in to do what we do, which is the scene examination, as soon as possible so that we have less contamination, if I use that word, or less traffic from other folks to have to sort through and work through.
I want to still focus on photograph C here. You talked earlier about being able to form an opinion regarding how the body was placed, whether it was dumped forcibly versus gently placed. Does this photograph remind you of things you saw that gave you some indication of that?
Yes.
Can you describe what that is?
Yes, as I mentioned, you can see her body here. I mean, you'll notice that the blackberry vines are kind of over the top of her body. Anytime you take a weighted object and you were to throw it, toss it, put it or place it on top of those types of vines, the vines are weighted down. Those vines are very pliable, very flexible. And in this case, we can see that the vines are actually over the top of her, where she's been placed underneath the vines, and they're not weighted down, indicating that there was nothing of weight that was on top of them.
I'm going to turn to photograph D. And can you just indicate for us again where the body is in this photograph?
Yes, her body is right here. This is an elbow you're looking at, and she's right there.
And again, talking about what you were just discussing, if she had been tossed, what would you expect to see with some of these blackberry vines or leaves around here?
Yes, I would expect to see her on top of these vines that are over the top of her. So they would be weighted down, kind of a U shape, and her body would be in the center of that U, if you can visualize it that way. And that's not the case here.
So earlier we were looking at the photographs of the sort of trail. Does that show a little bit of a U shape that you're talking about on photograph A here? Or is that a more exaggerated example of it?
Yeah, not necessarily what I'm referring to. I mean, just think of a vine, as you have likely seen when you're out of doors, and the pliability and flexibility of that vine, and how it kind of adheres. If there's thorns on it, it sticks to everything. But if you put something weighted on it, it doesn't break. It just goes and forms under the object that's on top of it, and that's not happening here.
How high, if you recall, were these, like we can see them in the photograph, but how high from the ground generally were these blackberry vines?
I would say that several feet at any rate, so my estimate would be maybe upwards of 3 feet off the ground.
So, I mean, like waist high, higher than waist high for the average person?
Well, I'm not necessarily average height, so for me it was probably about upper thigh, waist high.
Okay.
So about 3 feet.
I want to turn to photograph E, and again, does this photograph indicate anything about, well, first of all, let me ask you, at this point, had the vines been cleared by law enforcement?
Yes.
So in photograph D, all those vines that we're seeing on top, are those missing from photograph E?
Yes.
Okay. And the purpose of that would have been what? What was the purpose of clearing the vines at that point?
Yeah, to have a better view of her body. Part of what we do at the crime scene is a forensic examination, which is just a close-up examination of her body, of her skin, to ascertain as much information as we can about what's adhered to her, how she's positioned, and those are all important factors in the investigation. So by clearing away the vegetation, it allows us to see it better and also allows us to photo document.
Now, is there anything about the position of her body, and by that I mean the positioning of her arms or legs, that gives you any information about whether she was thrown versus placed?
Yes, I would refer to that as symmetry. So you can see here her arms and hands are kind of over her upper chest, and how position of her legs are kind of folded over on themselves. If you were to think of her as someone who would have been tossed or thrown, the symmetry is going to be much different. The legs are going to be out, the hands out from the body, not like she is here. This is more indicative of having been gently placed and laid there.
And would you expect, if the body was thrown and the arms were out, to see a wider swath of vines being pushed down around her?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything in this picture that you reminds you of observations you made relating to timing on this photograph?
Yes, but it's very, very hard to see.
Let me see if I can go to photograph F and see if that gives us more. This is a close-up of
Yes,
her
that's
face.
better.
Okay.
Yes.
So tell us what observations you were able to make at the scene that this photograph refreshes you about.
Several observations. The first one, which is going to be very difficult for you to see from where your position, that there is kind of a muddy dirt debris that's adhered to her, and there's actually spots on that indicating where rain has come down on her. So I can actually see indication of rainfall having occurred on her skin. The second being that I can look at some of these twigs that you see that are adhered to her face. Some are loosely adhered, others are almost impressed to her face as though weighted, which could potentially be explained by her head simply just resting on a surface that had these types of twigs, causing the twig to imprint to her face. You would have wet conditions when this happened, otherwise you wouldn't have it adhere like it has here. And so this tells me wet conditions. Again, I can see some of the spatter marks on the dirt debris that's on her skin, and I can see from the way some of these twigs and dead leaf litter and matter is adhered to her face that it was wet at the time that that happened. I'm also looking at this, there's two leaves here. This leaf, particularly of interest, is actually rolled up on itself.
Let me just for the record, so you're indicating, is that her left shoulder area you're
Yes,
talking about?
upper left shoulder.
Go ahead.
That leaf is rolled up on itself, which happens when leaf matter is very, very wet, saturated. If it's dry, if you can envision walking through fallen leaves on a crisp autumn morning, when it's dry, they crackle, they break. This has not done that. It's rolled up on itself, indicating it was very wet at the time that that damage occurred. I'm also looking at the color of that damage, indicating that several days, 5, 6, 7 days have passed in order for it to have that color. And then looking at this rotted leaf here, again, very, very wet when that damage occurred. When you step on delicate green leaves, or even not so delicate green leaves, when it's been raining quite hard, you get that mashy kind of effect that happens just from the weight of the footfall, and that mashy effect kind of stays like that until it begins to dry. And you can actually see here where the drying effect has begun on this, and I could see when I was there in person, I could actually feel it. It's not soaking wet, it's begun to dry, indicating that there was a period of drying that did occur with some sun hitting that and warmer temperatures that allowed that to happen. Again, adding to my opinion as to the time frame.
Let me go back a couple things. First, for the record, the sort of rotted leaf you're referring to is the blackish one that's kind of above her left shoulder.
There is a black leaf here that's hanging off this vine, and then there's a rolled, looks like either an alder or blackberry leaf that's here that's simply just rolled up over itself.
So I want to go back to what you were saying earlier in this question about the stuff that's adhered to her face. When you were talking about it needed to be moist, let me first ask a more general question. Was there any indication to you at the location where her body was, and I'm going to go back for a moment to photograph D, that there had been any type of struggle at that location?
No.
And what would you expect to see as a tracker if there had been some kind of movement between more than one individual or struggle between more than one individual?
Yes, you would expect to see that movement exaggerated on the ground. So as the person is digging in their feet to try to maintain balance, or pushing off in an attempt to get away, or striking or holding, there's a lot of movement and a lot of weight shifting that happens with the body or bodies that are in motion. And that translates onto the ground in the form of scuffs on the ground, tears in the vegetation, maybe tripping over some of the vines, so the vines would be asymmetrical, not so much in symmetry. And I didn't see any indication of that. The other thing that was not indicative of that was that she didn't have any marks on her that would suggest that there'd been any type of a aggressive struggle or fight that happened there.
So does that indicate to you that somebody took her there?
Yes, and more importantly, her feet were bare and clean. And I don't know if any of you tried to walk barefoot in this type of vegetation, but it's very painful. So there was no indication, no injury to her feet, indicating that she had walked herself out there, and there was nothing adhered to her feet, indicating that she had walked out there. Had she done that, there would be, I would expect, not only some cuts and abrasions to the bottom of her feet, but also some vegetative matter that would be adhered to her foot as a result of that, and her feet did not have any of that type of evidence.
So going back to photograph F, the close-up of her face, the matter that adhered to her face then, since you are indicating it doesn't appear there was a struggle with her there, how did that vegetation get on her face, from what you believe from your observations?
Well, that's a good question. The only explanation that I would have on that would be that her face, again, the weight of her head was down on some surface somewhere that had that type of matter that caused it to adhere to her face in that way.
So it's possible that at some point she was set down in some area and got that on her.
Yes, that's correct.
Is the type of material on the face something that also could have rubbed off on her when she was being carried?
Some of this, yes, some of this material that's loosely adhered to her is just typical type of deadfall from having been out in an environment for several days. Other matter that I mentioned that really seems to be impressed the skin is what I would be interested in, is potentially suggestive of her being in some other location where that was adhered to the face because of how her head was resting.
So is it your opinion that at the time this stuff adhered to her face, that area had to be wet, that it had to be a very wet area at the time?
Yes.
So most likely a time period of precipitation?
Yes.
Okay. If she had been set down on a day like the day you responded or the day before where you said it wasn't raining, you would not expect to see that kind of evidence adhered to her face?
Correct.
And you just made reference to some things on her face that may not have been gotten from right in this area.
Yes.
Is that what you said?
Yes.
Are there other things on her body, a dirt that you observed that didn't appear to have come from the area right where she lay?
Well, she does have kind of this muddy dirt transfer that's on her body. This isn't the best photo to show that, but you can certainly see some of that. I'm referring to her left shoulder and down several inches from the shoulder, and then right side of her neck you can see it as well. There's a grass head here that's green in color that I'm not sure where that came from.
And that's on that sort of bottom right of the photo?
Yes.
Is there an area near this area that had more of a muddy dirt type, I don't know, terrain, or how you want to describe it?
Yes.
What was that in relation to this area?
Actually, if we may use the diagram, it
Sure.
might be easier to...
Exhibit 22. So holding up Exhibit 22 again.
Okay, and so just refreshing, her body is here, and then you see this, it's marked dirt road. There was actually some equipment that was here at the time that we arrived at the scene that was doing some demolition work of this trailer park. This road was very, very muddy and dirty. So that's one possibility. I have no way of knowing for sure, of course, but it's a possibility.
But what you are concluding is that there's some dirt on her that couldn't have been obtained from right where she lay because there wasn't that type of dirt muddiness right there.
Yes, it did make sense to me as to how that got there.
And I want to go to the second part of what you were talking about in photograph F, because you were talking about the appearance of certain leaves around her left shoulder area, and you were talking about the aging of those leaves. Now, first let me ask, is it your opinion that a person in the body walking through this area is what disrupted these leaves and caused them to lay where they were? In other words, you're talking about the leaves aging, telling you about when this body might have been put there, and I'm trying to make sure I understand why you're saying that. Like, why does it matter the aging of this little black leaf over her left shoulder or the other leaf on her left shoulder?
Yes, I mean, those are the factors that I was looking at and forming my opinion as to how long she had been there. Looking at such things as well as the little tiny twigs and sticks that break when weight comes down on them, whether they had been rained upon prior to having broken, if there was any pliability in them when they were stepped upon, so I take in that type of information as well.
So assuming that they had been broken off as a result of this human activity with this body being placed here, so you're familiar with the way they look over a certain period of days, and you were making an opinion about that?
Yes.
And with that particular leaf on her left shoulder and sort of the black leaf over the left shoulder, what was your opinion on sort of the timing of those?
My opinion was that she'd been out here approximately 1 week, and by 1 week I mean 7 days, give or take several days.
And does that mean that if her movement had disrupted that leaf and caused it to lay there, the leaf then appears in color to you as it had aged about that period of time?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Let's go to make sure I covered everything I wanted to in this photograph. Yeah, let's go to photograph G. obviously there's a portion of her body in this picture. What else are we seeing in this picture, photograph G?
Yes, we're just seeing a close-up of what looks like a hair, which in fact we believe to be a hair, and so that was collected for evidence. So just to give you an idea of the type of information forensically that we were looking for. There's also a dead leaf here that's kind of curled up on itself and started to dry, and there's a break here. This used to have a thorn, and the thorn had been broken off as a result of some type of force up against it, which is indicative to a body having moved through that particular area.
So if her body had moved through that area and caused the damage both to this leaf and the missing thorn, are you able to tell anything about the passage of time since then from this vegetation?
I'm just looking at the damage where the thorn had been broken off, and the fact that it looked like to me that it had been rained upon. There was still some moisture content in that line, just beginning to start to dry, which would be consistent with the 2 days prior of the drying effect when the sun was out.
And are you also able to tell anything from the broken thorn about how long that aging process took from when it was broken, or can you not tell that?
It's a piece of the puzzle, so in and of itself, no, you wouldn't want to make any type of conclusive statement or even form an opinion, but I'm looking at that along with the other pieces of information that I've gathered from my examination, and so the totality of that information is what helps me to form that opinion.
And we're looking at photograph H now, and what are we seeing here? We're on the other side of the...
Yes, and so now we are, this is her leg folded up under itself. I was referencing symmetry earlier. You can kind of see how that is. This is her right leg folded up under itself, and you can see the blackberry vines that are up against her foot here. And this just gives you a really good idea of the type of vegetation, what the vinage looked like on this day. You can see this leaf here, how it's been folded over, turned up on itself. That's not natural. That's not a natural way for a leaf to grow, so something had to cause it to bend over on itself like that, some type of force up against it to do that. If the leaf is wet when that happens, you tend to have that fold. If it's been really dry conditions, you would expect that would be more of a tear to it. It wouldn't fold up like that.
So, again, assuming that the force applied was a person walking through and setting a body down in this area, was it wet when that leaf folded up like that?
Yes.
And obviously it's dried some since that period?
Yes.
Okay. Anything else that tells you in this photograph H, assuming that this area of vines was disturbed by the activity when this body was placed, anything that tells you about aging or how long ago that had happened in this photograph?
Again, we kind of see some of that muddy dirt transfer on this leaf here and this leaf here, possibly from something coming up against it, rubbing against it. Other than that, there isn't anything else I can see that I could point out to you that would help you understand that.
Okay. Turning to photograph I, where are we in relation to her body here?
This is right at her hip. You actually see she has a scar, so it's going to be her right hip area.
I'm going to have you point out a few things in this photos, but Your Honor, I'm going to ask permission to let the jury each have their own copy of this photograph during her testimony from this photograph with permission, because I think they'll be able to see better what she's describing.
Any objection, counsel?
Your Honor, just the same objections we made earlier that the court ruled on.
You may do so, but counsel, make sure you collect those after the jury uses them.
I'm going to hand these out and then we can talk about it. And I guess we should probably just raise the lights then so that the jury can see the photographs. I'll let the jurors get their photos and then I'll ask you some questions. So, Officer Decker, first I want to talk about, you took this photograph to document something indication of something you saw right next to the body there, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And what was that?
That was what I refer to as a toe dig.
What does that mean?
I'm sorry, could you please repeat that? I didn't hear that.
Toe dig.
Toe dig.
Toe dig.
So essentially what that means is it's a place where a person has put sufficient weight on the ball toe of the foot and is leaning forward that causes a kind of almost a rounded point. I know that kind of doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but I can show you what I'm looking at here. So kind of follow the outline of my finger, comes up like this, the toe, and the toe is right in under here, right up next to the body, and down and around like this. So the foot is positioned this way with the weight coming down towards the toe of the foot as the person is bending forward.
And again, it's difficult with a photograph, but can you point out the bends in the leaves that you see that are indicating some kind of force from maybe a football was applied there?
Yes, I guess the one that's going to be easiest for you all to see, if you look at this leaf here, and then you can see how it kind of dips, folds down a little bit. The outline of the foot actually comes up, right up against that leaf, and so if you can imagine the outside of the outsole here coming down and pushing down on that leaf causes that leaf to kind of fold down like it is, but it didn't tear. It didn't break, it didn't turn into crispy little leaf parts, so there was sufficient amount of moisture, rain at the time to allow it to have that type of pliability. And then the toe comes around up front here. You can see this bend in this vine, how that vine's been crinkled and actually damaged. And again, that's just from the footfall as it's coming forward and down. And all the way over here, I'll switch sides here if I may. My arm's not long enough. And then down here you have a little crease and bend in this piece of dead, I think it's a piece of dead glass that has kind of bended and creased forward, indicative of a football coming in contact with it. You have this leaf matter here. You can see it has some tearing has happened, which you would expect just from the motion of the person as they're bending down, pushing out against this leaf, causing it to tear as it did. But it didn't break up into little tiny pieces. So again, indicating it was wet at the time that contact happened.
There's one, it's a little hard to tell from the picture, this vine that sort of comes right below and sort of turns down to the right, is that broken, or do you recall what was going on with that?
It's bent, and that's just from, again, the damage that happens from the weight of the foot that's on top of it.
Okay. And so you saw evidence that somebody had stepped there and bent down. Are you able to tell that it's something from before as opposed to law enforcement or someone responding that day?
Yes, two things. Number one, the damage that I'm seeing, the color tone, the texture of the vegetation, the smoothness of the leaf, the fact that it's not crumpled up into little fragmented little pieces tells me that this is older, that this is more consistent with having been made upwards of a week earlier. Secondly, it would be unusual for law enforcement to be taking that position.
So you say a week earlier, and you're basing that on the aging quality that's happened when these things have been broken?
Yes, I'm basing that on all the information that I've spoken of up to this point, the aging qualities within the vegetation. And as trackers, we do take in the totality of all information that we have available. So the baseline typically would be the 911 call, any additional information that we would get in this case pertaining to when she was last known to have been alive. We use all that information to try to determine whether what we're seeing here is consistent or inconsistent with what we believe to be true.
So your opinion is that it was pretty wet whenever force was applied to this area based on how the leaves bent and didn't break, things like that,
yes.
Pliability. And just so I'm clear, there were a bunch of days of rain and then only 2 days of dryness since Ms. Pietz disappeared. So is it additional observations of how these have aged that tells you that it was a week as opposed to just the last day of rain that you talked about?
Yes, it's the color, especially the leaf that we were looking at that's on her shoulder. That was very important to me because of the texture of that leaf, the fact that it started to dry out, but it also had to have been very, very wet in order to have rolled up on itself like that. The spatter marks on her indicating some heavy rainfall that had occurred. So I'm taking all that into account, along with the information that we had when she was last known to have been alive. And so the question from a tracking standpoint is, am I seeing physical evidence here that's consistent or inconsistent with her death being caused shortly after she was last known to have been alive?
And is your opinion that she was placed there relatively close in time to when she was last seen?
Yes.
Your Honor, objection, that was leading.
Sustained.
What is your opinion about when her body was placed there?
My opinion is that she had been there upwards of a week, again, a week being 7 days, with a variable of maybe 2 days on either side of that. But that drying effect had to have taken place, and there had to have been sufficient amount of rainfall to get the type of conditions that I saw here.
And you mentioned earlier when I asked you, can you be exact to the day, and you said no. If you're asked to give a range, you've been saying a week. Do you know for certain she was placed there 7 days earlier?
No, I don't.
So what range would you give in your experience of the earliest and the latest, in other words, that she could have been?
In a 5-day and 9-day mark.
Okay. I want to go back for a moment to one of the other photographs that we were talking about in relation to, I'm not sure what was the best one. Well, photograph F, which shows the close-up of her face, shows some dirt that you described earlier that you believe didn't come right from that area. Did you observe that in other places on her body when you were out there as well?
Yes.
And you were talking about the fact that there's a dirt area down another road right near this cul-de-sac?
Yes.
So I know you can't say, but if she was set down initially in another area and then picked up again, that dirt could have appeared from that area.
Possibly. Yeah.
But you don't know exactly
I
what
don't
happened.
know.
Just one moment. I'm going to...
You can see.
Yes. One more question about that, Mr. Decker. Some of the material adhering to her face and body you had described as some of it being consistent with the area that she was ultimately set down. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
So in your opinion, could she have been set down in that area at one point as well and picked up and taken here?
Yes.
Okay. So she had not only dirt that might have come from a different area, but matter on her that was consistent with matter you might find in that trail leading to her body that you discussed?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Allen? Yes.
I have some more questions on...
Oh, I thought you were done.
No, she's got a little more. Officer Decker, obviously your job was not only to form some opinions. Oh, let me collect the photographs, actually. As we discussed earlier, you kind of had dual roles. You were also assigned as just a regular detective in the major crimes unit to investigate this case. Is that right?
Yes.
So at that scene, in addition to the tracking investigation that you did you work on collecting any other types of materials or things at that scene that were important potentially to the investigation?
Yes.
And do you know what kinds of stuff you might have collected there that day?
Yes, we collected hair that we found that was adhered to some of the blackberry vines. I recall pointing out to one of the other detectives who was actually taking custody of the evidence, some other litter, human litter, a cup, I think it was, a candy bar wrapper, those types of things that were not consistent with that particular environment that could potentially provide us with some important evidence in the investigation.
And is that common to do that at a scene like this, just in case it leads to something?
Yes.
Did you collect anything relating to these blackberry vines that were around her body?
Yes, the hair.
And did you collect any of the dirt type evidence that was around there?
Yes, we did take a swabbing of the dirt that I made reference to that was on her skin.
And is that standard, or is there some particular reason you do that?
What I was thinking of at that particular point in time was to potentially do some type of a soil analysis or sample to try to determine with certainty where she had been at each particular point as she's been. Of course, her final resting point is there, but where else had she been? What other areas had she come into contact with? And a soil sample can sometimes give us important information about that.
And how long do you think you were out at that location that afternoon?
Several hours.
Did you also assist in going to the home of David Pietz to notify him that his wife's body had been found?
Yes, I did.
Is that also a typical thing to do in a situation like this?
Yes, in-person contact, of course, is always preferable in these types of situations. When you have news that's going to be particularly upsetting to a loved one, you want to have that in-person contact.
And is it also important to get information, in this case, it's a woman who's dead, from her husband that might be relevant to the case?
Absolutely. The person who would know her best, conceivably the person who may have last seen her, that all becomes extremely important as we pursue the criminal investigation.
And is it pretty typical in a case where a wife is killed that you would at least investigate the husband potentially as a suspect?
Yes.
So when you went out to the home there, was the goal to notify him but also take an actual statement?
Yes.
Do you recall who went with you to that home?
Detective Jesse Anderson, who was the lead detective, Detective Ditto from Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, and Sergeant Stitch from Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. They're both from the Major Crime Unit in Snohomish County.
And why is it that Snohomish County was involved with you at that point?
Because the body, who we later confirmed to be the identity of Nicole Pietz, actually was a resident of Snohomish County in the Linwood area, and so the initial missing person case was in their jurisdiction, which fell into Snohomish County, so it was outside the city limits of Linwood.
And what was the address, if you recall, or if you need to refer to your report, of the home you responded to that was David and Nicole Pietz's home?
I could refer to my report.
Sure.
It was 15415 35th Avenue West, Apartment C like Charlie, or Unit C like Charlie 106 in Linwood.
And is that Snohomish County, Washington?
It's in Snohomish County, not the city of Snohomish, but yes, in Snohomish County.
Okay. And that's in Washington, though?
Yes, that's correct.
What time did you actually arrive at the Pietz home?
It was in the evening, I think approximately 8 o'clock, but if I may refer to my report. It looks like it was 20:34 hours, which is 8:34 p.m. on February 6th.
And do you recall when you got there, first of all, was Mr. Pietz there?
Yes.
And is that the defendant who's here in court today?
Yes, it is.
And was anybody with him?
Not that I recall. His father was there, yes.
Do you know, were you aware of whether he already knew that his wife's body had been found at the point that you got there?
I did not know that, nor was I aware if he had been previously told.
And did you find out whether he did, in fact, know when you got there?
My impression was that he did not know.
And did you and the other detectives inform him that you'd indeed found Nicole's body?
Yes.
Okay. And do you recall how he reacted?
Yes, he appeared to be a little bit upset. Remember, at one point he was kind of in the fetal position. He excused himself. He said he was going to be sick to his stomach, and he excused himself for a few minutes to go into the bathroom.
And I should ask you, when you talk about this, it was 7 years ago, do you have an independent memory visualizing this encounter and his demeanor that day, or are you referencing only what you wrote in your report?
I'm referencing what I wrote in my report.
And what you just testified to, is that documented in your report?
Yes.
So when you say fetal position, are you able to tell us today what you mean by that?
No.
And did you, in fact, I'm assuming this reaction was after you notified him, is that right?
Yes.
Did you, in fact, end up taking a statement from him that day?
Yes, we did.
And was he able to give a statement and answer your questions that night?
Yes, he was.
And right now, do you have any recollection of what his demeanor was like during that statement, any independent memory?
No.
Who of the, I think it was 4 detectives you had at the scene, who actually took the statement from him?
The lead interviewer was Detective Jesse Anderson.
And were you also one of the interviewers?
Yes.
Were you and Detective Anderson both present throughout the entire interview?
Yes.
And do you recall what time you began to take a statement from the defendant?
It was approximately 15 minutes later. My notes here state that it was at approximately 8:43 hours.
And did you begin tape recording that from the beginning?
Yes.
And did he agree to be tape recorded, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Stage exhibit 36.
And is it pretty typical that you'll ask to record statements that you take from potential witnesses and or suspects?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 36. If you could just pull this CD out and tell me if you know what this is.
Yes, this is a CD, DVD, R recording of the Pietz statement, and my initials are on it as I've listened to this and confirmed that it is in fact an accurate representation of the statement as it was taken on that day.
Thank you. I would offer Exhibit 36, Your Honor.
Your Honor, I have no objection.
Stage exhibit 37.
Is this a transcript of the same statement?
Yeah, I knocked out that and use it as reference. And then have them refer to it during the statement. During the playing of it, yes. Yes, Your Honor. I'm going to show you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 37. Are you familiar with this document, Officer Becker?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And is that an accurate transcription of the statement you took on that night from the defendant?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, at this time what I would like to do is publish the statement by playing it for the jury and ask that they have a copy of the transcript to refer to only during the playing of the tape. And it is about an hour and 14 minutes. So I defer to the court as to whether you want to start, break for lunch, and then resume, or start after lunch.
Let me say something to the jury. Any objection to having the transcript during the report?
No, Your Honor, as long as the court instructs the jury on that proper use of it.
Members of the jury, the original evidence is the recording itself. Someone has made an effort to take that recording and turn it into a printed form. One would assume they use reasonable efforts to do that. But if in listening to the recording, you find that what you hear is different than what you see on the printed page, then you should rely on what you hear if you're persuaded that it is indeed different, because you're getting it from the original source. And if your view is the transcriptionist got it wrong, then you may accept that as the evidence in the case. Now, we are giving you these transcripts simply as an aid for you to listen. I don't know whether you'll feel a need to look at the transcript in order to try to determine what's being said, but if you feel a need, you may look at the transcript. Okay? And then after we pass those transcripts out and the recording's over, those transcripts will be collected.
Thank you, Your Honor. Will you also tell the jury that this doesn't go back at the end of the case either?
Well, we'll talk about that later, counsel. They'll get something at the end of the case. But
We can take that up afterwards.
We can
Thank you, Your
discuss
Honor.
that later with counsel. All right. We can go ahead. We've got 15 minutes. We can start it. And of course, you're not going to take these transcripts with you at lunch. You're going to leave them where you're sitting on your chairs when you go to lunch.
Hang on, wait, if you would.
The witness statement that's made is David, I'm sorry, wrong name here. Martin D. Pietz Jr. His date of birth is 9/16/77. Home address is 15415 35th Avenue West, Apartment C, 106, Glenwood, Washington, 98037. Phone number 206-369-6034. And also involved in this interview is Detective Kathy Decker. Martin, can you tell you whether the statement is being tape recorded? Yeah. And have your permission to record it? Sure. Okay. Martin, we've gone over a few things here about getting some background information about your life, and I know we've talked about some very difficult questions with you that are hard to answer, but it's very important, obviously, you know, that we get as much information from you as possible, okay? Let's just review a little bit what we talked about. We just started interviewing you about 834, and now we just want to get into it a little bit more, but first of all, you told us that your wife goes by Nikki. Is that correct? And how long have you been married? Almost 4 years. Okay. And again, not to go over it too much, but when's the last time you saw it? Friday night. When I got home from work. Okay, and that's Friday, January 29th? Or January 27th? Okay, sure. Okay. Yeah, 27th. Okay. And you say you got home from work a little after midnight, is that right? Sure. Okay. Well, I'm not trying to no. Yeah, that's, yeah. Okay. Where do you work at? 24-hour fitness. I want to downtown Sept. Okay. What time do you normally get off work? Well, normally I work 10 a.m. to 7 p.m., but I had to cover closing shifts, so I got off. Supposed to get off at 11, but my data person had questions, so I was there a little bit after, so I don't know how long. Okay. So you obviously got home later that night than your typical coming home time is. Yeah. And when you came home, Nikki was here, right? Yeah. Okay. Tell me about where she was at when you got her to sleep in bed. Okay. And which bedroom do you have here? From the back. One of that. How many bedrooms do you have? Two. Just two. Okay. And one serious office is kind of area and to the left. Okay, that's the master bedroom, all right. Okay, and you said that you had a short conversation with her. A couple words. Yeah, a couple words. She wouldn't even wake up all the way. Okay. So what did she say to you? Something like, hi, welcome home, or I'm glad you're home, or something, and good night, basically. Okay. And also, so to make sure when you were going to, you stopped somewhere on the way home, is that right? Yeah, I stopped at Safeway to get Drano. Okay, and that's the Safeway up here 99? Mm-hmm. You know, across the street over like that? We work in County, so I'm not away from there. It's 148, I don't know. It's 148 maybe? Okay. I don't know. That's the main one, right? Yeah, just the one. Yeah. Okay. And you showed up there probably a little before midnight then? Sure. It takes me about 25 minutes to drive home, so I don't know exactly what time I left. I would say probably a little before midnight. Okay. So you bought some Drano. Did you buy anything else? I bought a little bit of alcohol. What kind of alcohol? Yeah. I got Mike's Hard Lemonade, the red stuff, and it was cranberry. Okay. And hasn't paid for it? Yeah. Okay. Did you get a receipt for it? Maybe, I don't think so. I don't usually keep receipts. Probably not. So you told us that you went to bed shortly after saying goodnight to your wife? No, that's when I said goodnight to her, when I called her. Then that's when I woke her. That woke her up a little bit. Yeah. Okay. Did you unclog the tub? I poured the drain on it, and that's what I said. All right. Okay, so did you told us that you got up in the morning, and then Nikki was gone, right? What time was it since you woke up? About 8:20. I just remember thinking I only had 10 minutes, and I was panicked. Okay. Because it was late. All right. What time do you normally start work? 9. It's a ways to go. Okay, and between the time you went to sleep and the time you woke up, did you hear anything unusual, or no? I was asleep part. Then you also told us Nikki's normal waking pattern in the morning is at 5 or 6:30, right? Or 5 or 5:30? 5 or 5:30. Okay, and that's typically during the week? Yeah, she never sleeps in. She always gets up at like 7 or 8. On the weekends? Yeah. Okay. Even on Sundays. Okay, on Sunday, okay. Doesn't go anywhere on Sundays. The Saturday mornings, she has the 8, right? At 10:30. Okay. Does she always get up at 5 or 5:30, or early on Saturday morning? Just about. Well, she gets up, she almost always meets with her sponsor before the meeting. Okay. She hasn't gone to a couple meetings because her back hurt too bad. Not her back. So it was a birthday meeting, so she was going to go, and she hadn't seen her sponsor for a while. So I think she said she was coming with them. I don't remember. I just remember thinking that that's where she must be when I woke up. You mean with, I'm sorry, her sponsor or sponsee? Okay. And AA, you have a sponsor. Right. And then you sponsor people sometimes. Right. Has a sponsee too. Okay, so who the sponsor, you said, is Pam, right? Who's the sponsee? Barbara. Okay. And so she meets with either one or both of them? Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, that's what she told me. So yeah, she meets with one of them. Are there any other sponsees that she meets with? She just got a new sponsee, but she doesn't live in Renton. I think she met her at work. I've only met her, I think, once. I don't even know her name. I'm trying to get a hold of her. I don't know where she went, but they went to a meeting, I think on a Wednesday. Oh, she said by Walmart, right here. I don't know that sponsor. I don't know her name. She's short. She came in and waved at me last time I did. Do you say she typically goes to meetings on Saturday morning down on Vincent Hill? You can't, right? Or Renton? Okay. Why did she go so far away from her meeting? That's her home meeting. That's the meeting she first went to when she got sober, so she knows everybody there. She likes her. She's always gone there. She lives in Seattle, she lives in Boston. She always goes there. And did she go there before you even met? Yeah. Okay. But occasionally she goes to some other local ones. She went, I think she just went that one time. I don't know if she's been there before or not. She didn't like it because it's a smoking meeting. She didn't like to smoke. Okay. But it's up by the Walmart, huh? Yeah, it was like, I don't know where, but she said it was close. It was right up by the Walmart. I don't know what building it is. Okay. Which way is Walmart from here? That way. You go down to 164th and turn left and go across the freeway. Oh, okay. Towards Mill Creek then. Yeah. All right. I don't know the sponsor's name. I haven't talked to her. Have you talked with Pam and Barbara? Yeah. How are they? I think Barbara saw it yesterday because she left me a message today when I was at work on my cell phone that she sounded pretty upset. Okay. And last time I talked to Pam was at the prayer official, but she emailed me the other day. Told me where she put up flyers. So you say they meet up early in the morning before the actual meeting and go over progress? Or do steps or something, I don't know what that is. New program stuff. Is Nikki still struggling with addiction? She wasn't, but she hurt her back right before Thanksgiving. She slipped a disc and was bulging on a nerve, and went to the chiropractor and it made it a lot worse. So her doctor said she needed to go on Percocet, and she's a pill addict. That was her drug of choice. I don't know if it was Percocet, but pills were. And was she told about that? Yeah, she knows about that. She's been treating her for a while, for like a couple of years. I think last we got married and moved to Seattle. Okay. And who's the doctor? Dr. Carol Wayman. She's my doctor too. Wayman? It sounds like it sounds, I think. She's Green Lake Family Medicine. I can find it, that's fine. So both of you have been going through it for quite a while then? Well, I haven't for very long. I just needed a doctor and I didn't want to bother to find one. I feel like Dr. Wayman, so I started going to her. Okay, so she slipped, hurt her back. Yeah, I don't know. I think she was picking up the dog when she did it. Okay. She sometimes won't jump in the back of the car. How long ago was this? Right before Thanksgiving. Like a week before Thanksgiving. And then she's been taking the Percocet since then? Yeah. What makes you think that maybe she started using? I don't know if she did or not, but the only thing is... something that you have... Well, no, the only thing is when I came home, jumping ahead, when I came home on Saturday, that day, and because she would when she missed her dinner meeting, we waited for her for a while, but then I decided I should come home and check if the Percocet bottle was on the counter and it was empty. And I thought that they were doing like a week at a time, because she always had to get new refills, but this bottle set had 56 tablets in it. That's way more than a week. Yeah. And when was the last time you saw that particular bottle? You know, I hadn't seen it in, well, she just filled that bottle on the 26th is what it says. I can go get it for you. It says it on the 26th is the last time they filled it. Okay. But the last time, when we first started, she didn't want to be on them at all, and the doctor had to tell her that if she didn't use the pain, that the body would relax and it couldn't heal. And she had to talk to the sponsor about it. And at first, she had me keeping the pills and then giving them to her. Okay. And then, I don't remember when, but somehow, like I left them on the counter or something, and then they just stayed on the counter for a while and she would just take them. And then again, I don't remember when, but I think it just got bad enough that she needed them during the day while she was at work, so she had them in her purse. And she always, like, I would have to ask her what time it was and how long she had her pill last. And she was always like, well, it's only been, 3 hours and 50 minutes. I have to wait 10 more minutes. So it seemed like she was okay. So every 4 hours she was taking pills? Every 4 hours she would take 2 pills. And she would usually take like 1.5 unless it was really bad. So it seemed like she was okay. I just quit paying attention. I guess I just got used to it. So how long did it go with you giving her the pills? Not that long, actually, because she started needing them at work. Maybe like, I still carrying the pills at Thanksgiving, you remember? I think maybe right around Thanksgiving was the end of that. Oh, we can come back for Thanksgiving. No, I was. You were over it there. Yeah, we did. I was still at the pills at Thanksgiving, so maybe like...
All right, we'll take lunch.
Terry? And the transcripts.
In the transcripts. Leave it everywhere.